Well, thank you very much, Brian. Kia ora tātou. And wonderful to be here to participate in this 75th birthday. This is all about the Pacific, and we have a formidable panel here. And as I've told them, well, there were two members in the last panel, so this panel will only get half the time that the others had, and even that will probably be cut short. On becoming Foreign Minister in 1990, I was very conscious that the Pacific was an area of importance to us because of its closeness, but of which we knew little about. And I say we New Zealanders knew little about it. New members of Parliament knew nothing about the Pacific. They'd been to Europe, they'd been to North America, they'd been to Asia. So I instigated what became these annual Pacific tours, borrowing a very comfortable aircraft from the Minister of Defence and taking a bunch of MPs, NGOs, sometimes some high school kids, MFAT officials, and it was always a group of about 40 or 50. And we would visit about 4 or 5 Pacific countries. And we did that for probably most of the 9 years that I was minister, and I was glad that my successors carried it on because it gave us, New Zealand, a Pacific nation with something like 400,000 Pacific peoples here, a greater knowledge of where these people came from, their homes, their families, their background, their education, the role of the churches. And I think that today still gives New Zealand a place in the Pacific ahead of most. Our knowledge of the Pacific is considerable, and long may it remain. So you have this formidable panel here in front of you. From closest to me, Gerald Hensley, known to everybody here I know, pulled away from his grapes in Martinborough, and Gerald, delighted you could come. John Hayes, another diplomat, spent a lot of time in the Pacific. He and I worked together when things were of interest on the island of Bougainville. Anna Powles, a well-known name in these circles, Senior Lecturer in Security Studies, Centre for Defence and Security Studies at Massey University, and Damon Salesa, Director of the Pacific Strategy and Engagement, University of Auckland. Welcome to you all. Gerald, it is yours to kick off.
Thank you, Don. Members of the Diplomatic Corps and distinguished guests, because people who are interested in foreign affairs are by definition always distinguished guests. I want to talk a little bit about our history in the Pacific and where it might be felt to be leading us now. Geography made New Zealand a Pacific country, but for a century, sheltered by the Royal Navy, it took only the vaguest interest in its immediate neighbours. Occasional spasms of recognition had a touch of farce, like Sir George Grey's proposal to raise a battalion of Maori to take Tahiti. Hints of a desire to take over Fiji later in the century were equally firmly rebutted by the British Colonial Office. At the end of the century, New Zealand was momentarily gratified to annex the Cook Islands, but it took the Great War to further advance our modest imperialism by the seizure of Western Samoa from the Germans. In the period between the wars, New Zealand administered its new territories rather lethargically, doing its best to conform to the British imperial model. In an old safe in Apia, I found a proclamation issued at the height of the Mao crisis in 1931, regulating the size of mess cuffs to be worn at Government House. But however placid our administration, we warmly resisted American claims on our new islands, and Britain told the State Department in 1938 that taking an atoll away from New Zealand would be, quote, as difficult as taking butter out of a dog's mouth. The second attempt by the Germans, joined this time by the Japanese, blew all this away. The Atlantic Charter, announced by Churchill and Roosevelt before America had even joined the war, declared, among other principles, that all peoples had the right to choose the form of government under which they lived. What this meant in practice was never spelled out, but as early as 1943, it had become clear to Australia and New Zealand that it would not be possible, even if it was desirable, to restore the old order in the Pacific. In the post-war world, the security of the Pacific would be in the hands of the US Navy, and Washington would have an inevitably large say in the changes of territory that were coming. Both Australia and New Zealand became alarmed that the Pacific would be reshaped around them. Australia's restless and tactless Foreign Minister, Bert Evatt, suggested the two dominions needed to get together to ensure that their voice was heard, and the Canberra Pact was born. There were only two meetings, one in Canberra, one in Wellington, and both managed to upset both London and Washington, especially the rather grand declaration they made that no territorial changes should be made anywhere in the Pacific without the consent of the two countries. New Zealand, however, in the person of the young Frank Corner, had prepared briefs for these meetings which thought deeply about the future of colonies, asserting that the aim was independence or self-government and that some form of international supervision was needed to ensure that they got there. Naturally, said Alistair McIntosh, no one will read them, and perhaps they didn't. But the anti-colonial thinking entered the Prime Minister, Peter Fraser's, bloodstream, with astonishing results a year or two later. Britain and the US had spent 2 years from 1943 in working out a draft charter for the new international body they envisaged, the United Nations. Surprisingly, though, their draft had nothing to say about colonies, because the British were unenthusiastic and an American draft was locked away by interdepartmental feuding. It was left to Peter Fraser, chosen almost accidentally as chairman of the Committee on Colonialism, to settle the issue. He began by announcing that the committee would work under the rules of the New Zealand House of Representatives. And since no one else knew what these were, it gave the autocratic old man considerable freedom. Despite the necessary negotiations and compromises, much of New Zealand's thinking about colonies appeared in the Charter, especially the fundamental principle of international supervision. Fraser's committee produced not one, but 3 chapters of the Charter, invented a principal organ of the UN in the Trusteeship Council, and established the trusteeship system. If it could not apply trusteeship to all colonies, as we wanted, it at least managed to establish that reports on the administration of all colonies should be supplied to the UN. This small and almost unnoticed provision opened the way over time for much wider public scrutiny of the colonial system and became a major lever in the effort to end colonialism. After these excitements, New Zealand had to decide what to do with its own trust territory, Western Samoa. A constitutional convention assembled in Samoa had laid down that the territory should progress over 10 years to self-government as a protected state under New Zealand, called the Tongan solution because it was modelled on Tonga as a British protected state. As the 10 years drew to a close, however, This arrangement looked increasingly old-fashioned, at least to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Discussion chaired by Frank Corner suggested that the choice of independence should be offered to the Samoans. It caused uproar in Wellington, with both the Department of Island Territories and our High Commissioner in Samoa, Anna Powles' grandfather, upset. And even sterner objections arrived from our fellow colonial administrators. It was argued that so small a territory could not sustain independence and that it would unsettle their Pacific territories, which had much more complex political problems, like Papua New Guinea, Fiji, Micronesia. We argued, of course, that Samoa was stable, with a long tradition of representative decision-making, and we thought, but did not say out loud, that it would be a further advantage if Samoan independence speeded the end of the Pacific as a colonial lake. Samoan independence was and remains a success, but it left New Zealand with an even more difficult challenge: what to do about its remaining responsibility for a handful of small islands and atolls scattered over 1 million square miles of ocean. Everyone agreed that independence was not feasible, and besides, the inhabitants of the Cook Islands and Niue were New Zealand citizens and wished to stay that way. Various ideas were considered, but federation with New Zealand was ruled out because of distance, and federation with other Pacific states because of lack of plausible candidates. Then, in a UN resolution passed in 1960, the ministry spotted a passing reference to free association with another state as acceptable means of decolonisation. No one knew what free association meant. It was never defined in the resolution. But that suited us. It meant we could define it for ourselves. Amid the inevitable scepticism from politicians and islands experts, discussion between the ministry and the New York mission thrashed out the details. It was concluded that common citizenship or other links to New Zealand were not an obstacle. The essence of free association was that the Cooks or Niue could at any time change their status without further reference to New Zealand. What someone in a flash of inspiration called continuous self-determination. The UN Assembly liked it, and New Zealand's increasingly uncomfortable time as a colonial power was over. There was a last block to be put in place to complete the new Pacific architecture, although we needed the establishment of some means of collective discussion and action. Decolonisation in the Pacific was not quite done in the case of Kiribati, Vanuatu and Papua New Guinea, but the necessary collective association was created when New Zealand hosted the first meeting of the then called South Pacific Forum in 1971. The forum completed the framework of the newly independent Pacific. New Zealand could take a justifiable pride in helping turn the South Pacific from a colonial lake to a tranquil association of free states. For 3 decades, our interest in the South Pacific settled into a comfortable routine, disturbed only by occasional bumps, such as Bougainville, which I think we handled well, and the Fiji coup, which I think we did not. Most of our aid budget was spent in the region, and our prime ministers were scrupulous in their presence at the annual forum meetings. Speeches like to emphasise the importance of the South Pacific to us, but they lacked a little conviction, often referring to the South Pacific rather patronisingly as New Zealand's backyard. Tranquility, though, is always temporary in human affairs. Now the balance in the Pacific is shifting. Our familiar world, secured for us for 2 centuries by first the British and then the US navies, will have to accommodate the rise of a Chinese blue water navy. This has many important implications for our future, but one of the more immediate ones is the effect on our forum relationships. China's active diplomacy and expanding aid program gives forum members an alternative to their reliance hitherto on support from Australia and New Zealand. It is a warning that our half-century as prefects of the forum class is coming to a close. The permanence of geopolitics is underlined by the fact that the Ministry is again giving careful thought to the South Pacific, 75 years after it first did in 1943. We are all very welcoming that the reset is underway, starting with a major increase in the aid budget, with the greater part of $714 million to be spent in the forum, on the forum members over the next 4 years. This is welcome and even overdue, but it can only be part of our response to the new challenge. We cannot win a bidding war with China over aid, nor do we need to. We have an enormous asset which China can only envy. We have soft power, a huge range of Pacific relationships, both formal and personal, built up over many years. New Zealand is itself part of Polynesia, with a long history of family, religious, defence, trade, work and immigration links. 250,000 people originally from the region now live in New Zealand, and at Christmas and other festival times, our aircraft are packed as people move back and forth. It is hard to think of any other country that enjoys the depth of soft power that we have in our relationship with the South Pacific. The gift, however, is not free. Its value depends on how carefully and how sensitively we use it. There has always been a faint but distinct fault line in the forum between the former administering authorities, Australia and New Zealand, and the smaller island members. This hardly mattered in the overall life of the forum as a Western institution resting on common Western assumptions. Now there are non-Western actors in the region. Other countries are ready to listen to forum members if the 2 developed members seem unresponsive. We will need to take great care to ensure that Australia and New Zealand do not come to be regarded as outsiders in the forum, as not being truly Pacific countries. It has been fashionable, at least since the days of Sir Robert Muldoon, to talk warmly, but a little condescendingly, of the Pacific way, the Pacific style of diplomacy, which avoids direct clashes, is happy to take as long as is necessary to talk differences through, and is not afraid of comfortable periods of silence while doing so. It is more than that, though, the Pacific way. It is a way of looking at the world, and our continuing influence in the forum will depend not just on aid, but on how well we can work with the Pacific way. The Fiji coup of 1987 saw the overthrow of a recently elected government and the first constitutional crisis facing the forum. New Zealand denounced the coup vigorously from the prime ministerial pulpit, and was disappointed that other equally law-abiding members of the forum, like Samoa, reacted as friends of Fiji and muffled their rhetoric. New Zealand's moral disapproval was justified, but was it wise? Did we speak as a friend of Fiji or as a judge? We underlined then our difference with the Pacific members and ruled out any chance of being able to help Fiji repair the damage, leaving us with nothing to do diplomatically but sulk for several years. Our traditions of robust discussion in New Zealand may limit how far we can follow the Pacific way, but it is reassuring to know that once again the Ministry and its Minister are thinking about reframing our Pacific concerns to meet the changes that are coming. Thank you very much.
Absolutely perfect timing, Gerald. As I was always going to say at the beginning, I also insisted it wasn't our backyard, it was our home region, because we didn't want to be seen to be in Australia's backyard. It's home region. Don't forget it. John.
Thank you very much. It's a bit interesting here this morning. Don and I both went to Lincoln different times, and so I sort of got muddy boots and learned to be a farmer. But Gerald straightened me up for a wee bit in Singapore, and anything I ever learned about diplomacy I learned from him, so thank you, Gerald. And well, I'm going to go really fast this morning because what I'm trying to do is to compress more than 25 years of engagement with Papua New Guinea and Bougainville into 10 minutes. I want to make a couple of points that I think are very important for you all to understand, comment on various peace efforts, and end with some thoughts about the chapters that still have to be written, because 2020, mid-2020, is when they actually have to have a referendum on Bougainville about independence. Papua New Guinea is the sort of place, I don't think the High Commissioner is here this morning, Papua New Guinea is the sort of place that always feels like it's going to drop off the edge, but somehow never does. And I was told that early on by Bill Dim, who was the then Secretary of Foreign Affairs about 30 years ago, and somehow that's always been good advice. Now, the North Solomons Province, or Bougainville for short, has for decades been a really reluctant part of Papua New Guinea. And between 88 and 97, a low-intensity conflict, military words, ebbed and flowed across Papua New Guinea's province. It was vicious, it was brutal, villages were cooked, by that I mean burned down by the police, burned down by the PNGDF, and burned down by other Bougainvillians. Schools and hospitals were closed, infrastructure was destroyed. I remember on one occasion going up to see Francis Ona, walking through glass that was 6 inches deep, broken, all the buildings around completely destroyed. And all I could think of was Golding's Lord of the Flies as I was trying to get my head around understanding what had gone on to cause this destruction. Atrocities were committed by all sides. Military threw people out of aeroplanes, helicopters out over the sea, all sorts of things went really wrong. But over 9 years, Bougainville's most wealthy and developed province reverted to a state of subsistence without services, and it had been Papua New Guinea's most advanced and wealthy province. Between 89, when I ended up in Port Moresby as High Commissioner, and in 1997, there were many attempts at peace, all failed. But in each of those, we learned lessons which I think contributed quite significantly to the eventual success of the peace arrangement or the peace process between 97 and 2001. In 97, a truce was secured, followed by a permanent ceasefire in 98, and then a peace agreement in 2001. It's valid to celebrate those achievements, But it's also important to understand the final referendum is still to come next, 2020. Whatever the referendum outcome, there will be significant implications for Papua New Guinea and the whole Pacific. The outcome is likely to end up somewhere between the extremes of, on the one hand, the possibility of a failed state of 200,000 people, or a return to strife, because there are going to be issues that Bougainvilleans are not happy about. And the point about the referendum is that it's conditional. First of all, it's conditional on having good administration going on the island. It's also conditional on all guns being removed. The UN process messed itself up and didn't get rid of all the guns, and in the last few years, a lot of guns, high-powered rifles, have been going back there. The second thing is that once you get the referendum, irrespective of what the community decides of the referendum outcome, the government of Papua New Guinea has to ratify the result. And if you follow Radio New Zealand, you'll see that the present Prime Minister has on a number of occasions saying, independence is not going to happen on my watch. But let's back up a bit. 1989, my letter of instruction said the post should stay out of Bougainville. It was an issue for Australia and Papua New Guinea to resolve. Well, one thing I learnt at Lincoln, I think, was to think logically, to trust your common sense and your judgment. So I thought about the instruction, and then we set up a rotation for an officer to spend a week at a time down in Arawa while this fight was actually taking place, beginning, and the mine had closed down. And there were two objectives. The cover we used was dealing with the consular issue. We had New Zealanders down on the island, so that gave us the reason to go down there. But also from what I'd been thinking was that one day we needed to develop relationships, because we didn't know in the office any of these Bougainvillean leaders at that point. So we went down and we used that time to develop as many linkages as we could, because it seemed that one day they might have been useful, and they were. So too many of our colleagues have been brought up to believe that diplomacy needs to be conducted in an office environment. Well, as you can see, it isn't always. It's by stepping out and having confidence in your judgment that coming from a small country we can add value. And we've got a lot of advantages. Because we're small, we can move quickly. Because we're small, we don't intimidate other countries. In those interventions on the island that went on week by week by week, staff including Jeff Randall, Eileen Besser, Joe McDougall, Simon Jimson, Rob McAllister, Neil Riley took real risks. Simon and Rob both got caught up in firefights. We were a bit lucky that there was no damage done. But those guys were down on the island with the old two big, huge suitcase sat phone. That was the only link that they had back to civilization. I don't know if you remember those things, but they were huge and they were heavy. The import of our support staff was also critically important. I had a new officer turn up at the post on Cheryl Chisholm. I called her on the second day in town at 10 o'clock at night to say, please come down to the office. We are desperately needing to ring New Zealanders on the island to ask them to leave, because Air New Guinea was about to lose its insurance cover and there would be no other way of getting them out. And she and Maureen Fitzpatrick picked up many expletives from New Zealanders who assured them that the High Commissioner didn't have a bloody clue about what he was doing and telling us to do, and we knew better. But luckily, all but two left the island before the Air New Guinea fell over. In 1990, talks initiated by Papua New Guinea took place on the Endeavour. Naval support at that time was signed off by Prime Minister Palmer. Tony Brown, who I think is here today, and the Papua New Guinea Minister Samari, and at that time, who was Foreign Minister, and Narakobi, Minister of Justice, turned up. And there's a meeting a photograph there of a meeting where we were putting this together. There's the head of the Prime Minister's Department on the far right, Paul Bengo, who I'll comment about in a minute, Bill Dim, Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Leo Nuia, head of the PNGDF, and the last man was the boss of police. Now, that exercise resulted in something called the Endeavour Accord. I went to see Paul Bengo 6 weeks after the accord had been signed by the ministers and the BRA and said, "Paul, why is nothing happening?" His exact words were, "Those black bastards caused this problem and they can live with it." Paul unilaterally torpedoed that agreement. No other consideration with anybody else in the government. I mean, their system works a bit differently to ours. Then there are myths about how we worked. Some are true, but looking back, we were asked to put more than our professional necks at risk. In 91, we organised some senior officials' talks down in Arawa using a boat called the Sun Come Up. Now, in the photograph on the right, you can see a few black bags there. The deal was, writing from both sides, no guns. Turn up at the wharf in Booker, which is a 2-hour flight on a jet from Moresby, and there's these guys that I hadn't recognised before, these big black sports bags. Well, they all contained guns and ammunition. Anyway, what do? Stop it? Go ahead. We went ahead, mainly because I trusted Iligeno, the Commissioner of Police, and I thought, if he's there, we're probably going to be all right. Anyway, what they overlooked was that the crew on the Sun Come Up, this local provincial trader on the left-hand side as you're looking up there, they were Mortlock Islanders. They speak Maori. They're Maori in every sense, except that they're on, and they live on an atoll about 120 miles off the coast. Anyway, they get down to Arawa and they say to the BRA, "Hey, this boat's got armed PNGDF on it." Well, that caused a 2-day delay before we could get a dialogue underway. The interesting, and the talks were on that red boat there, which was from Peter Barter. It was a Hong Kong car ferry of some sort, and I think it subsequently sank, killing about 200 young Bougainvillians. Anyway, what happened, it was really interesting to see these fellows at the end, all the heads of department, and we had about 10, 15 of them there, who were absolutely petrified. They thought they were going to get killed. That's why they brought the PNGDF along. But in a Melanesian custom, if you've got something that someone doesn't have and they'd like it, you really got to pass it over, part of the family. But it's Melanesian, not Bougainvillean. So all these heads of department lost their watches, their clothes, their shoes. They came back with only a pair of shorts. We weren't on our own. Peaceful efforts were tried by the Commonwealth, by Australia, by Solomon Islands, by Fiji, by the Forum Secretariat, and by the Commonwealth Secretary-General. Anyuku sent down a Nigerian general to resolve the problem. And a guy called Chris Uma, who was the local BRA leader around Arawa, he parked this general under a plane wing in the heat of the day without water, without anything. And I met that guy later that night in Moresby. He was unhappy. He was a very unhappy man at the way that he'd been treated by these rebels on the island. Later on, Anyuku prevailed upon the government, please lend us a frigate to the Commonwealth because we're going to hold talks on it. And I kept saying to Wellington, look, Papua New Guinea doesn't want this to happen. Well, I was absolutely unsuccessful. But then there are other ways to get our colleagues to understand where our best interests lie. On a Saturday morning, the day the frigate was to depart, I went and met Namalu down in Rabaul, an hour and a half away from Moresby, explaining to him that while I understood when a Tolai said yes, he can mean no, but Anyuku didn't. So eventually Namalu smiled at me, and he then phoned London, and in very definite terms said, "Thank you, but we don't want this to happen." And I was able then to go back to, well, then London rang Wellington, and then Wellington believed, yeah, the talks were off and the boat was stood down. I think an important element of the peace process in 2000, it worked because Don organised the money to fund a process. He was also quite good at just saying, "I want this fixed," and he'd leave you to get on with it, because you can't go to a library and find out a book, how do you solve this war, or how do you solve that issue. And on one occasion, I remember after the Aussies had taken over, that I got calls from the island, from people like John Momus and Sam McCoy, and they said, look, nobody's talking to each other now. This thing is going to fall over because all these leaders were trying to jostle with each other to be the top dog in the piece. So thought about it, talked to various shrinks. We didn't have the time or the money to solve it in a normal sort of way. So we organised the process involving Maori, and we parked these main contenders on Matakana Island, having first of all taken them to Hopa Hopa. They'd had a presentation from the Maori Queen about Tawhio throwing all the guns in the river, and the Bougainvilleans' eyes were out on stalks. Very different, these fellows listening to a Maori than listening to a Pākehā. The outcome of that process, which was really quite brutal, was that they started talking to each other after 5 days, and then they went back and they set up the autonomous government which is in place now. Incidentally, we tried to use Maori process around the coup in Honiara, and we started to make quite a bit of progress. And I said to Phil Goff, who was the then minister, look, we annoyed the Aussies last time by not telling them, let's tell them exactly where we're going and what we're doing. And Downer made it very clear Australia wasn't going to let that happen under his watch either. So he preferred to spend $2 billion on an intervention, which is what it's cost. And go back to Honiara now, the core issue between Malaitans and Guadalcanal has not been addressed by that exercise. Anyway, moving ahead. So there are steps still to be completed. There has to be a referendum on independence by the middle of 2020. It could get stymied because Papua New Guinea might say, no, the administration on the island's not good enough, or there are too many weapons. Weapons haven't been removed. The good news is that 5 days ago, the referendum question was settled, and also I'm aware that 2 of 39 constituencies have reported to the Bougainville Parliament that they're referendum ready. Now, if the referendum is held, as I said before, O'Neill can say, no, it's not happening on my watch. And that could end up in going back to conflict. If the government accepts it, I think it will still take some considerable time to sort through the arrangements in a new status. So I've got no doubt in my mind that Bougainvilleans are going to vote for Broke Loose. But when you think about that, and I've walked up and down, I mean, I've met a lot of people there, and what you realise is they have no clue as to what the implications of independence are for them. Now, there's some good work that is beginning to go on. The UN is doing some educative exercises, and the churches this time round, some of whom caused the trouble last time, are actually being quite sensible. People don't understand, well, how are we going to pay for education? Where are the hospitals coming? What are our airline rights? What are our fishing rights? What the arrangement will be. I think that there are still a lot of guns on the island. That's a problem. And in the circumstances, I really think it would be imprudent for New Zealand to take its eye off the ball or to treat the issue with complacence. It may not be too late to commit resources, especially through the churches, and to educate voters. The questions they're going to have to answer is, do you agree for Bougainville to have 1, greater autonomy, or 2, independence? Simple as that. So I think peace is a very important issue in our community. Anything you can do under war, you can do better under peace. We must continue to invest what's needed to prevent armed conflict in the region and to continue to build the relationships and networks on which future peace will be based. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Now please welcome Dr. Anna Powles.
Tēnā koutou. I'd like to begin by firstly acknowledging, of course, the distinguished speakers and guests that we have here today. And ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here for such an auspicious occasion. I have been asked to consider what the Pacific story looks like in the future. And to do so, I'd like to begin with the most significant shift in foreign policy towards the Pacific Islands in decades, which of course is the Pacific Reset, which my fellow panellist, Gerald Hensley, spoke about this morning. And I'd like to consider a fundamental challenge going forward, and this is the challenge of balancing principle and pragmatism. So early this year, the government announced this recalibrated Pacific policy, and the call to shift the dial on New Zealand policies towards the region was a direct acknowledgement that New Zealand's relationships with its Pacific partners did not adequately reflect New Zealand's place in the Pacific for a start, the challenges facing Pacific states themselves, and the geopolitical shifts within and challenges to the regional order. At its core, New Zealand's Pacific Reset seeks to address two interlinked questions. First, what is New Zealand's place in the Pacific, which, as we've heard this morning, is a question that we have been asking ourselves for a long period of time and will continue to do so. And secondly, what is New Zealand's place as a Pacific nation in the world itself? And although New Zealand has long identified as a Pacific nation born out of geography, demography, and identity, the strength of our Tangata Pacifica population, for example, and the language and rhetoric around a shared Pacific identity and destiny, at times policy divergence and approaches have placed New Zealand very much on the region's periphery. And we heard also this morning about fault lines within the forum, which have remained strong and arguably clear, and if we're not careful going into the future, will become more so. So the Pacific Reset offers an opportunity to not just look forward, but also to look back. It offers an opportunity to challenge long-held assumptions amongst the New Zealanders and the New Zealand government about New Zealand's role in the region, about our influence, about the kind of relationships that we have. And because we cast ourselves as very much part of New Zealand's international currency of being a Pacific nation, do we actually have the depth of knowledge, the depth of expertise, and the depth of relationships that are required going forward? In the months since the launch of the Reset, policies and narratives have promoted by the aid and defence lobbies have competed for centre stage. Both, however, have overlooked the Prime Minister Ardern and Minister Peters' commitment to a reset which goes beyond development and defence practicalities. Increased expenditure in development space and defence projects certainly will make a difference, but it won't increase influence. Trust is very much the currency in the Pacific, and relationships trump policy to a large degree. A focus on strengthening Pacific relationships must be at the core of the Pacific Reset, and this means smarter, deeper diplomacy in the region, and there's a number of examples where that can be extended. But also remembering that New Zealand's strength, as soft power strength, is very much as leadership in terms of values, and this is something that needs to be exemplified even further. At stake here is very much New Zealand's identity and credibility as a Pacific nation, and its ability to navigate the shifting regional order, which brings me to the core challenge, the fundamental challenge for New Zealand going forward. Much of the strategic debate about the Pacific this year, in parts of Wellington, in Canberra, in Washington, even in London and Tokyo, has been about organising the geopolitical space in the Pacific and the concern that China is seeking to reshape the regional order in its favour. And these are certainly very legitimate concerns about the impact of geostrategic competition in the region, and I'm sure we're all very familiar with aspects of that. But what the strategic outlook fails to acknowledge is that there is already a robust Pacific-led agenda which is seeking to shape the rules and assert greater political control over Pacific regionalism in response to external influence, and that includes New Zealand and Australia. And yet what has emerged over the past 10 months or so is a one-dimensional, essentialist strategic debate which provides little space for Pacific voices. One that puts too much focus on major powers' geostrategic interests without recognising the region's complexities, including non-traditional security challenges. Dame Meg Taylor, the Secretary-General of the Pacific Islands Forum, said a few months ago that the Pacific Islands region has been largely absent from these debates. Very little has been written and published from a Pacific Islands perspective, and the Pacific Islands has rarely featured in the discussions except from a perspective of vulnerability to China's influence, and therefore as part of the Indo-Pacific that needs to be secured by and for external partners. Because at its core is a perception that Pacific states do not understand these strategic risks. That Pacific states are in some way passive dupes to Chinese influence, unaware of regional geostrategic challenges. In August this year, at the Lowy Institute in Sydney, the Samoan Prime Minister responded to these ideas, stating that there is a patronising nuance in believing that Pacific nations do not know what they were doing. And one has a tendency, Tuilepo goes on to say, to be bemused by the fact that the reaction on the part of Australia and New Zealand is an attempt to hide what we see as strategic neglect. So the danger of going down this rabbit hole is that very near-realist approaches, which tend to dominate particularly Australian and the US strategic debates about the Pacific, will lead to narrow strategic calculations based on material power and undermine genuine strategic understanding of the interconnected threats to the Pacific faces. So a critical challenge for New Zealand going forward will be to uphold the core values and principles of the Pacific Reset, such as genuine partnership, in an increasingly securitized environment. This is the balancing of principle and pragmatism. And what will be critical is that ensuring that security imperatives do not trump the Pacific Reset. For example, New Zealand will need to be increasingly mindful of how it negotiates some of the contradictory and divergent areas of Australian policy within the Pacific region. So looking ahead, the success, therefore, of the Pacific Reset policy will in large part be determined by New Zealand's ability to contribute to shaping a favourable regional order that prioritises Pacific priorities, needs and aspirations, not at the expense of New Zealand's national interest. The two are not necessarily mutually exclusive, as well as developing a deeper understanding of where and how New Zealand fits into the new regional order. Thank you. Kia ora.
Damon, Salesa.
Ngā mihi nui, nau mai haere mai ki tēnei hui, a whiu mai susu mai. Mā lole su fue mā lange mama. Welcome everyone, and I guess on an anniversary you say happy anniversary. I'm not sure what the gift is for a 75th, but I'm sure it's very meaningful. I wanted to acknowledge all our distinguished guests, especially our diplomatic corps who are visiting us, and of course the MFAT staff, as well as those who have come in to reflect on New Zealand's foreign policy. And it's one of those moments, I think, where we have to celebrate, because a government department that endures for 75 years is worth celebrating, but also where we should reflect on what that means. And it's been a wonderful panel which has come at this question from several distinct angles. But one of the key ones is that in New Zealand it's often assumed that foreign policy crosses governments, that it's consistent across changes in personnel and people. And it's a really interesting project for us today to assess on the degrees to which that is evident. And actually, we saw an unusual confluence between two previous prime ministers who were largely in agreement on this, yet also pointed out some critical changes that took place. And so we've heard, just on this panel, some of this going forward. One quite deep talk going back all the way to New Zealand's origins in the Pacific, which looks at New Zealand's moment in the past, which has extended right into the present. And I often remind my students that New Zealand's nearest neighbour, by the constitutional definition of the realm of New Zealand, is Samoa, to New Zealand's south. And that is a legacy of a very deep Pacific history, and one that Gerald Hensley knows very well. And then to reflect on the Ramsay moment, one of New Zealand's signal achievements, not just in Pacific diplomacy, but effectively in global diplomatic leadership, and something that I think we should rightly celebrate because so few New Zealanders acknowledge it or even are aware of it. And then Dr. Powles has also asked us to really think about the bigger trajectories at a moment of apparent change in New Zealand's priorities and relationships to the Pacific, at an exact moment where for the first time we have seen a large player re-enter the Pacific in a way that could change the entire fabric of Pacific foreign relations. I myself was trying to think of a nice Pacific proverb to capture some of what we might do on a day like this. And I actually thought of one of my Samoan teachers who used to quote another tribal poet, but a Scottish poet. And the particular proverb a piece of his poetry he would quote was, "Oh, would some power the gift give us to see ourselves as others see us." And at a moment like this, we might reflect not just on our own vision of our foreign policy, but on the visions others have of it. And when we think of the Pacific story, which is the name of this panel, we might think about how that story changes depending on who's telling it and which audience they're telling it to. And with that in mind, as well as this imperative today to both celebrate and reflect, I just wanted to add a couple of things to what the panel have said and which they've inspired as thoughts. One of them is the ways in which, and Dr. Powles alluded to that it's become central to New Zealand's way of behaving internationally, that it has a special role in the Pacific. It's been a way of authenticating New Zealand's commitment to a rules-based international order and proving that we conduct an ethical foreign policy. One of the phrases I've often heard officials and our leaders say is that New Zealand amplifies the views of the Pacific. But in truth, one of the other things that happens is the Pacific amplifies New Zealand's views. And that kind of relationship is critical to the seriousness with which we can operate in multilateral spaces. I think it's also, we're dealing with a world where we are still struggling to contain the complexities of our history, and I think Gerald Hensley's talk was very powerful on this and very eloquent on this, that we have very unusual arrangements within the New Zealand domain, citizens who are born in other countries, territories like Tokelau to the far north. And we struggle often to narrate this because we are very committed, as we've heard, and we claim a very strong commitment to decolonisation. But one of the things is we foreclosed many decolonisations in New Zealand. And perhaps the most powerful one was the one in New Zealand, which is an ongoing process. And part of that process of decolonisation will be felt when we actually conduct our foreign policy in an authentically Pacific way. This is one of the growths, I think, that will be an enormous advantage for New Zealand's foreign policy. Because if New Zealand does its foreign policy different, it strengthens our claims and our connections to the Pacific. I think the US, and I was reflecting on this during Gerald Hensley's talk, the US in 1901 was confronted with the problem of places like Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa. How do you describe these places within a constitution which is explicitly a decolonized constitution, which the American Constitution putatively is? And when it was left to the judges to rule on their relationship to the United States, they came up with a very curious phrase, the Supreme Court justices. They declared that those places were foreign in a domestic sense. And so much of the way New Zealand faces the Pacific is dealing with that question of what it is to have foreign places that are not truly foreign to us. And when you go to a place like Auckland, of course, are deeply, or at least some parts of Auckland, are deeply Pacific places. And one of the questions we might ask ourselves is how have those deeply Pacific places changed what MFAT does and will do over 75 years? Are we doing things differently now that we are decolonised and a Pacific nation, or do we have perhaps further we can go? The last point I wanted to make, Professor Cappy and I were obviously reading the same book about MFAT, but I was reflecting that actually I didn't think MFAT was only 75 years old. And I've written a couple of historical pieces where I'd made an assumption that MFAT agreed with my history, which was that it was older. And one of the things we know from scholars like Edward Said, the Palestinian scholar, is where we choose to start our story often defines the story we tell. And there are a bunch of other places I'll invite you to celebrate even deeper histories of MFAT in. So in particular, in 1902, the Ministry of the Cook Islands was founded. Right? And these are sometimes called orphan ministries because they don't often get folded in. But that was the department that conducted the affairs of the Cook Islands until 19 1919, and Niue as well, even though it was called the Ministry of the Cook Islands. And in 1919, the first External Affairs Ministry was formed. And that was the External Affairs and Cook Islands Department. Sorry, it wasn't a ministry. And that was the department that oversaw both New Zealand's island territories, as they would come later be called, and its external relations prior to that moment that we're celebrating here, which is the signal moment during World War II. And then in 1943, we saw a separating of external affairs and island affairs by the establishment of the Department of Island Affairs, of Island Territories. And actually, there's a very complicated history, which I've tried to unpack. But what I'm really sort of encouraging us to see is that this has been a question at the heart of New Zealand's external affairs for a long time. Should the Pacific be a part of its foreign affairs, or is it foreign in a domestic sense? Thank you.